Welcome back, everybody, to the School Leadership Show. Joining me, as always, is co-host Jen David Lang. Hi, Jen.
Hi, Mike. Good to see you.
Great to see you, too. And we have a very special guest today joining us, Craig Randall, who is the author of Trust-Based Observations, Maximizing Teaching and Learning Growth. So, Craig, welcome.
Thanks for having me on, Mike and Jen. I appreciate it.
Thrilled to have you on. And I think back to my days as an elementary school principal and doing hundreds of teacher observations a year. And I was telling somebody this afternoon at work that we were doing this interview and we were talking about observations, and he had been a principal too at one point. And we were just sort of lamenting that the whole process. And then I started thinking, I haven't done a teacher observation in like 5 or 6 years. And I thought, holy cow, it's crazy. So let's get into it. Tell folks a little bit about yourself, your background, and how you came to write this book, and then we'll get after it.
Sure. I guess I always like to say I have a fairly eclectic career, basically on education. I started out as an elementary counselor, did a year in a severe behavior class where I actually had to do restraint 180 straight days, which is pretty crazy. I coached on the side, as so many of us do, had a chance to detour into college basketball, small college coaching, did that for 7 years. And then my wife and I had always talked about working at international schools. So we took another major detour and ended up in Warsaw, Poland, and was teaching there. One of the principals in Poland said, Craig, I think you ought to be a principal. And I was like, the dark side? Never. And then I thought, well, what the heck? And when I did that, and I have to say, I was frustrated with observation, even from the best people back then, just because it was so infrequent. And I was in the midst of 2 years of not being observed at all, which didn't help matters. And that's where I met my mentor, who ran my supervision class, Warren Aller, out of Western Washington University in Bellingham, Washington. And I remember in the first day of supervision class, he said, you have to be in classes every day. You have to be observing teachers. You have to be supporting their growth. You have to be asking them about their teaching and learning, asking them what they might do differently, and just helping them. And it just like the light bulb went off that everything that I was thinking about what was wrong, he was saying what was doing right. And in his class, we would bring little 10-minute mini lessons every single day, and we would do them. It could be on making a paper airplane, it didn't matter. And then we would have a reflective conversation. And it always started with 2 questions that Jen, I know, which were, what were you doing to help students learn? And if you had it to do over again, what, if anything, might you do differently? And that still drives trust-based observations today. I was really lucky. I got my first assistant principal job in Korea. And I was at a point where the principal was at a point in his career where what really excited him was having somebody young and enthusiastic. And though I might not have been young, I was enthusiastic. And I said, hey, I've got this great idea for doing teacher observations. And he said, all right, let's do it. And we did it together. And I'll tell you, it was amazing right off the bat, because teachers appreciated us coming into their rooms to have the conversation. They appreciated us asking them about their teaching instead of telling them about their teaching. And the second part was we shared the strengths, and we just scripted back then, and they just appreciated that. And we didn't get feedback right away for a couple of reasons. One, I didn't want to get feedback on something that maybe they were good at, and I just hadn't seen them yet, because I just knew that would be a disaster for building a relationship. And 2, I was the new guy and wanted to be liked. And so maybe I was a little nervous about giving feedback. But then a really amazing thing happened, and I didn't know it was trust back then, but about the 3rd time through, I just had a bunch of teachers say, okay, but what can I get better at? And that really started the whole wheels spinning about there's something here that's going on where people were really embracing the process, and they would take really bold risks to improve their practice, not just like getting from a 2 to a 3, like you might think of in the modern models that are predominantly out there. And then just along the way, it just developed. And when I was in Brazil, the head of school there said, I'd like you to teach the other principals about it. I was flattered and said, okay. And we started working every week with them. And one of the principals, the elementary principal, about 3 months in said, Craig, you ought to protect your work. And I said, what are you talking about? And he goes, this is really good stuff. And I said, really? And so I thought, wow, I'll present at a conference. And I did, and it went really, really well. They had to bring in extra chairs. And I thought, wow, I'll write an article. And Learning Forward accepted my article. And then we ended up coming home and we had some money saved from overseas, and I wrote a book.
Very nice. That's cool. Wow. Are there any countries that you didn't work in? That's pretty impressive. It's really cool.
It's a pretty wild experience for sure.
So let's talk about how the book is organized. So,
Yep.
It kind of starts off in the first section, talking about observation, problems, and solutions. So,
Yeah.
From your perspective, I think, most folks probably have a good idea of what's wrong with the traditional system, but from your perspective and from what you've learned over the course of your career and even putting the book together, what do you identify as the main issues with how folks typically approach observations?
Well, I think there's a lot. I think infrequency. When you see somebody, a lot of schools and districts have it once a year, maybe twice a year, and maybe they'll say there's informal ones on top of that. But when it's often been so long between visits that neither person can accurately remember from the previous visit, then how can we meaningfully use visits to build upon one another? I think, research says anything more than 10 indicators on an observation form, and people tend to lose the forest through the trees, and they're checking boxes instead of seeing teaching. There is no doubt that evaluatively rating teachers works against them. We have the measures of effective teaching, the Gates Foundation study that says 7 years, $200 million. Actually, if you add the money the schools put in, it was $450 million, and no sustained improvement through basically using nothing personal, because I know it was well intended, the Danielson model. And then there's a guy out of Great Britain named Matt O'Leary, who I think is the predominant researcher on observation in the world. And his research found out that as soon as we start to evaluatively rate teachers, they tend to play it safe. And I think he didn't say pedagogy, but I think he meant pedagogy, because that's the part that cuts closest to our heart. And so he found out that they tend to play it safe. There's less relational trust between observer and observee. And then the results of that are less risk-taking, innovation, and creativity in practice. So altogether, we just have a ton of evidence that says what we're doing right now isn't working.
Well, and I think, in defense of Charlotte Danielson and anyone else who's ever written a rubric about teaching and learning, they were never meant to be used as evaluative tools. Like, come on, it infuriates me. Okay, so let's jump right into it. So what did you find? So what works then from your perspective? And I think, folks sort of have an idea. I think we generally know, certainly frequency is huge. What else it jumps out?
So, I'm going to tell you, way back in the 60s, when the clinical supervision model first came out, Goldhammer and Kogan out of Harvard, which is based off of the doctor clinical rounds model, they talked back then about a continuous cycle of observations, but somehow that just went by the wayside. So yeah, that's a big part about it. But it really, really is about creating conditions of trust so people feel safe taking risks. And so when we go, well, if you think about it, we say this, whether you're 7, 17, or 37, getting called to the principal's office feels like getting called to the principal's office. So instead of having the reflective conversation in the teacher's room, in our office, we have it in the teacher's room. And so that makes a big difference. We always just ask permission. Frankly, it's a formality because no one ever says no, but it's a little thing that makes a difference. And so we do that. We sit beside them instead of across from them. And if we think about, there is a hierarchical difference in our position, and we're trying to minimize that. So if I can sit beside you, that minimizes it, versus if I sit across from you. It's almost like I say, like I have 19-year-old twins, and if I try and talk to them facing them, they won't really talk to me very much. But if we're in the car sitting beside each other, you guys know what I'm talking about. They'll start talking about everything. And I think there's a bit of that works in it too. I definitively think that when we start by asking them questions, and that they are the same 2 questions that we've always asked, and we have more, but that's the core of it. And then you're listening to them, and it sends a message about reflection is an expected part of practice, which I think most teachers do anyway. That just flips it on their head. And the mindset the teachers have, the sense of safety that they have when you ask them about their teaching, I think that's huge. sharing their strengths. And so it's been interesting because written the book and I'd always done the observations sitting beside them. But now as I'm training schools and I'm sitting across from them and watching it from a different angle, it's been so interesting to me because I watch teachers leaning in to the observation forum and watching it as the observers are sharing the strengths. And you can just see their wheels are starting to spin and they're starting to think about their own practice and ways they can get better. And so we actually have a toolbox possibilities hyperlink under each area of pedagogy. So you can dig into it if you want. And I watch teachers and that the next day I'll see some of them and I'll say, did you look at that, the toolbox possibilities? And they're like, yeah, you can just tell they just start spinning and thinking on their own. So sharing their strengths though is huge. And without ratings, just sharing what we saw. One of the things that we're seeing is teachers are saying, before when somebody would talk to me about my practice and what was good, they'd say, oh, it was great. You have such a great way with the kids. And they just felt like it was really, really general. But now when we can talk about one of the 9 areas on the form, very, very specifically, use their words, use details of what they've done, they just appreciate the specifics of the praise so much more. We had a teacher say recently, just say, you know, all a teacher really wants is just to have their strengths recognized. And later on, she saw that the observer that led that conversation at the end of the day, as she was leaving the building, and she gave that observer a hug and just said, you don't know how much it meant to me to have those things shared with me. And so I think people take stuff like that for granted, but it's really, really meaningful. And so it's all of that together really is what it is, and not rating the pedagogy. We can evaluate other parts of your practice without evaluating your pedagogy. And that together makes people feel safe. And when they do, they will take risks to grow.
I want to pause you for a second because I think you're getting into the form and people may not know what that is yet. But
yeah.
You know, what really struck me about your book was the emphasis on the trust, and that leaders know they have to build trust, but they don't necessarily see it as part of the teacher observation process. And, you know, a couple of things. Well, first of all, I love how you phrase, you know, in no other profession does the boss come into the employee's office, sit there, watch them work, and then leave, right? And tell them later how they were doing, you know, and you really just show how vulnerable teachers are. By having that kind of strange observation system, you know. And the other thing you say is that even starting with a question, even asking teachers to reflect on how they might have taught a lesson differently, which many of us have done, and we think that's an innocuous question, but really you're assuming that they could have done it better by asking that question, right? And so that involves a certain amount of vulnerability. And you talk about the principals taking a moment to think about the vulnerability of putting teachers into this position, on top of the fact that you are their boss, right? And the power of empathizing with that vulnerability and perhaps sharing themselves as leaders when they've made mistakes or when they've been vulnerable. And I think that's all a part of building the trust too, is understanding the vulnerability of what we're making teachers do and empathizing.
You're so spot on with that. You know, Brene Brown, Daring Greatly was a book that influenced me a lot when I was writing. And she talked about trust being a marble at a marble at a time, every single thing. But the other thing about it is too, you could accidentally, though, one little accidental wrong move and that jar of marbles could fall over. So we have to be really, really careful about every single thing we say. But vulnerability is a scary thing. And it can be a really good thing, but it's only a really, really good thing if we can lessen vulnerability enough so that people can work through the vulnerability to take the risks. And that's really what we're trying to do with the process is make it so they know that we're there to support them. One of the things that we say in the training all the time, and we've changed the form around just a little bit while we're always tweaking it. Every time we do a new training, somebody says something that makes us do a little adjustment. But we always tell the teachers that the ultimate goal of trust-based observations is for me and every other school leader here to create trusting relationships with you and every other teacher in the building, so that you know, if I go into your class and I watch you trying something new and it's a disaster, that the next day you with absolute certainty know that you're going to get a high five, a fist bump, praise of some sort for taking risks. Because when we can create those conditions of trust, everyone in the building will be taking risks. And when everyone's doing that, we will necessarily be growing. I mean, it doesn't seem like rocket science, but it's not the way it's currently working.
How much, okay, so as I'm listening to you, how much
Yeah.
of your approach to this was influenced not only by your work as a teacher, but coaching at the college level? Because I'm seeing a lot of parallels there in terms of, because it isn't about just play harder. It's, you know,
No.
like, so how does that fit in?
It's a good question. I think in some ways, I think the counselor part of me maybe fits in better because I think that's my natural personality. I used to be called nice a lot when I was younger, and I rebelled against that. Who wants to be called nice? But now I embrace it. And so I think being nice and empathetic, like kind of like Jen talked about, is a bigger deal. Honestly, if we talk about the coaching, I sometimes think the hypocrisy in the way that I yelled sometimes at a coach in comparison to trust-based observations is highly embarrassing for me.
Well, so it was the counter example, right? We coach maybe a little bit differently than we teach. So
Maybe
I love it, and you know, and nice is okay. Nice matters. So
it does matter. It does matter. I embrace it now.
Well, and I think what you're saying makes a ton of sense, and I think we don't pay enough attention to it because teaching is a deeply personal activity. Like it is, you are, just by the nature of being up there and exposed like that, you are vulnerable just by the nature of working with students. And like you said, this arbitrary, weird system of your boss showing up and sitting in your office watching you work. Like, I love that. I mean, because that really is what we do to people.
You know, just real quick, the vulnerability of teaching, you know, Parker Palmer, The Courage to Teach, one of my all-time, like I would give that book to every first year teacher because I think it's that good. And he has this great example in the beginning of the book that he, oh my gosh, I'm so sorry about that. In the beginning of the book, that he went to school that day, like on top of the world, feeling like he'd mastered it. And he came home that night thinking, what am I doing? The first class wouldn't shut up. They were fighting with each other all the time. The second class, I couldn't even get to respond at all. And that night I went to bed thinking, I wonder if at this late age in my life, I think he was like 56, if I could get a new job, maybe even something that I'm good at. And I think the point behind that was teaching is incredibly difficult. We're dealing with the unpredictability of developing brains and what they're going to bring every single day to class, whether that's something that happened at home, just whatever that is. And so despite our best plans, we never know how it's going to go. And we can do our best to adapt. And some days we'll nail it and feel like, I've got it, I'm the best. And some days we're like he is, like, this is ridiculous, I'm horrible at this. And just that he articulated that was like, I think what every teacher thinks, but he said out loud, and that is the vulnerability of teaching. Well,
usually Mike plays the devil's advocate. Do you mind if I play that role, Mike?
Oh, have at it, Jen.
Uh-oh.
So
go for it, grasshopper.
Okay. So in your model, and you know, as you're speaking about, you know, being called nice, and in your model, you do 3 full cycles where you only share what's positive in the classroom, right?
Yep.
We have all seen teachers who are frankly not really doing a good job, and it's a disservice to the students, and from the students' families' point of view. So as the devil's advocate, you know, what do you say to people who say, you know, the first time you go in and you see destructive or unfortunate or poor teaching skills, why not address them then?
I think it's a great question. And I think there's always exceptions to the rule. So if there's ever a situation where student safety or well-being is at stake because of the way they're being treated or anything that's happening in the class, or classroom behavior management, especially with younger teachers, newer teachers, is so poor that the class can't function, then I think we can jump in right away and throw that out, because that's our number one job, is to do what's best for kids. And so in those situations, we do that. And I think also with younger teachers, brand new teachers, my wife is a new teacher mentor. She works with 25 brand new teachers every year. And she'll tell you that planning and classroom management are the 2 hardest things for first year teachers to be good at. And so I think we can have some exceptions to the rules, but definitively we will see teaching that's less than stellar. I think particularly secondary, high school, you'll see maybe more traditional lecturing kind of teaching that's yawnish, and I don't know if that's a word, but let's just make it a new word now. And despite that, nothing harmful is happening to kids there, and it's what's been going on anyway. So if I'm in a cycle where I'm seeing a teacher every 3 or 4 weeks, what's the harm in that waiting there if it's been okay? As long as if down the road, because we've built this relationship, they're going to be much more willing to embrace good practice. Again, having said that, in situations where it is really unsafe or it's a new teacher, absolutely, we change the rules.
Well, and I wonder too, how much of it is, so much is about communication and expectations, right?
Yeah.
So how, did you ever have those conversations with the staff as a whole and say, listen, this is my approach. I'm coming in here. My plan is to really get to know, how you operate and really find the things that you're doing super well, but understand that, there might be something where, we need to talk about something in a constructive way, like immediately. Did you ever have those kinds of conversations where people sort of like because I feel like that goes to building the trust too. It's just like, listen, teenager, I was a high school teacher, I taught elementary school too, but you can have conversations with kids and as a counselor, listen, whatever you tell me is confidential unless I'm worried. And then it's different. Like, so did that figure in at all, or is that just sort of going on inside your head?
To be dead honest with you, no, I never did that. But I think I just talked about what I am doing and that the cycle of how it is, and that we're going to ask you questions and we're going to share strengths. And I would say, of course, in time we'll offer permission or we'll ask suggestions. But even then, I will say we always ask permission to offer suggestion first, and it's just a semantic difference, but it makes a difference in how people respond. And so we didn't really have to tell people ahead of time. What I would say, maybe related to what you're saying, is I would say the form works as a way of setting expectations, because the form, obviously, reflection is an expected part of practice with the first 2 questions is there, but the areas are learning targets. Oh my gosh.
Wait, so pause right there, Craig. So go back, because not everybody has read your book. So explain what you mean by the form.
Okay. So we have an observation form that we use to drive what we're doing. And so at the top of the form are the questions, which we only put them at the top. So that just reminds us to start the reflective conversation. So we always do a 20-minute unannounced observation. And the plan is, if your school is big enough, 12 a week is the maximum that you can sustain. And so we do 3 observations each on Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday, and then three reflective conversations on Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday, Friday. So Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday, you have 6 total visits and 3 each on Monday and Friday. So you kind of use your planning time with that. So on the form, beyond that we've got areas of pedagogy and that we look for, and we've narrowed it down to what we think are strong areas of pedagogy, but that's manageable. It stays into that research that more than 10 and we lose the forest through the trees. And so with the areas on the form, so it's learning targets, relationships, behavior management, cooperative learning, working memory, questioning, formative assessment, descriptive progress feedback, and specific differentiation. And then we have a retention of learning pyramid, which isn't really about pedagogy, but we're just placing what the different activities you're doing, where they are over the course of the 20 minutes. And so what ends up happening, and it's been really much more interesting for me training schools now with the start of the school year, to again be on the opposite side of the table and see it. And as teachers are looking at the form, and there's a lot of tables on the form, really what that form does is it sends messages about expectation for practice, and it's all just good practice. And so one of the coaches recently, when I was in Denver, they were training their coaches with the assistant principal and principal. And she said, before I always felt like I was the one doing the heavy lifting in the coaching conversation. And she said, just after 1 week, I'm watching the teachers and how they're looking at the form. And I can already see the way they're thinking, that they're the ones taking on the heavy lifting. And so they're starting to do it on their own, many times without you're even having to offer suggestions, because the form just drives them to think about their teaching.
Have you
I
come ac-
really like, oh, sorry, can I
No,
just
go
say
ahead.
one thing about the form? I really like this form, and I hyperlinked it in my summary of your book, and obviously it's in your book. Because sometimes I find when I observe teachers, I know a wide range of pedagogical strategies. I do a ton of reading, but not every school leader does. And I feel like this is helpful because it helps them point to a solution. So if they see an issue with classroom management, right? Or they see an issue with formative assessment, your form gives them lots of strategies to suggest to the teacher or for the teacher to look at. And your form is hyperlinked with all of these ideas. How do you do differentiation? What are the best ways to do differentiation? What are the best ways to build student teacher rapport? So I really found a lot of power in this form that you created.
I want to just add something to that because I think it's really important because we're also in classes so much. We also see who is particularly expert at each of these areas of pedagogy. So one of the other areas that we can support their growth is through the form, obviously, but another way is pairing an expert teacher with a teacher that wants to get better in that. And we know who that teacher is. Whereas when we're infrequently visiting classes, we might not have the same knowledge to understand who's particularly good at what.
And I think that goes a long way toward reinforcing the vulnerability of the school leader too, because it isn't as if you are the font of all pedagogical knowledge. It's, hey, I saw, Sally down the hall. She's really good at asking these types of questions. And Bob is amazing with pre-assessment. So, they know much more than I do. They're way better at it. You got to talk to them. And that has to go a long way.
I think it definitely does. And I think when we do, we ask permission to offer a suggestion. And so we pre-plan, like, what are we going to do? Is it going to be pair that expert? Have I already decided what I'm going to pull up from the hyperlinks? Am I going to maybe send them out to some other external training to prepare them and support them? But I think in a lot of ways before, like, you think the traditional model, these are the areas where you're not as good in. So I want you to get better at these 6 areas. Well, that doesn't work. I definitely know one thing from coaching experience is that if I work on a bunch of things getting better at once, we get better really at nothing. But if I focus on one area and intensely support your growth in that one area, you're going to get better in that area. And so that's what we do. And I'll even add, to make it as comprehensive as possible, when the teachers set their action research goal, even though we don't have a rubric that we use to rate it, there's a self-assessment rubric that teachers use for the form. And they use that to pick one of the goals. And we have a professional development community led by an in-house expert that meets monthly to also support the growth for that teacher in that goal. So it's not just get better, it's supporting you and continuously supporting you and getting better. And I'll just add this, we think about goal setting. I can tell you I've been guilty of this. I've set goals in September when we were told to. And in May, when the principal sends out the email about the end of the year reflection on your goals and your evaluation, I gulp, pull up my goals and think, oh, good, I have worked on those, but not purposefully as I ought to. And so with this on the form, one of the other questions that we ask is, talk to me about your progress on your goal. So not only were we providing the support, but again, the accountability piece, we're asking you about it every month. And it's amazing how teachers actually like knowing that they're going to be asked about it because it keeps them on their A game.
And at the same time, maybe that goal is not appropriate anymore, or maybe
Yeah.
they want to work on something else based on feedback and the conversations that you've had throughout the year. So keeping that fluid, again, I think, just reinforces that this is a collaborative process, and that this isn't something that gets done to you. This is something that I support. Basically, I support you in getting better, teacher. And yeah, that makes a ton of sense.
I support you in getting better. What can I do to support you? I'm going to continually support you in getting better. And
This
guess what?
conversation,
Then you get better.
This makes me want to go back and observe teachers. I'm realizing how much I miss these conversations.
I will say that I'm just going to say this is that principals now are saying, before it was a drudgery because it was this checklist that had to be done, a duty that had to be done. It didn't feel meaningful. And now principals are saying, I can't wait to get back in the classroom. And it's like, now I have a formula. I have like, what does frequent mean? Even when they say get in frequently, Now we're not saying frequent, we're saying this is what you do specifically. And so having that guide, it even sets an expectation for the principals, and that helps them. But then when you see a teacher respond positively, every single training I've done with the school, while we're sharing the strengths, I've had at least one and usually multiple teachers every week, teary-eyed or on the verge of tears, joyful tears, having their strengths shared with them. So when principals start to experience that joy and see what you're doing to get teachers, and don't tell me it's not going to affect retention, it's going to improve retention. We have teacher shortages. I guarantee you the observation process is contributing to that process. And now principals want to observe. They see the joy in it. They watch their teachers grow. Then they watch I was lucky enough to have Hattie endorse the book, and this wasn't in my mind when I wrote it, but he said it's collective teacher efficacy in action, what we're doing. And really that is what it ends up being.
Well,
Can I ask one final question? Because I know we're getting late.
oh, we are. Yes. Go ahead, Jen.
But you have a question too. Maybe it's not the final one, but one of the biggest elephants in the room is that most principals would look at this and say, this sounds great. I am in support of trust-based observations, but then they don't get into classrooms. And even though you make it very clear, right, it's these 12, 20-minute observations / conversations a week, but then, they have lots of fires they're putting out. So can you leave us with, or leave leaders with a tip as to how to really make this actionable?
I mean, it's a bit like working out. You have to make yourself do it every day. And if you fall off the horse one day, because definitely as a principal, we know those things happen. And there will be days where you can't do it because of a fire that's not a literal fire, but a figurative fire that you have to put out. But when you're doing it, besides making yourself do it, if you have an assistant principal, hold each other accountable. Let's get together every Friday and talk about it. If I have a principal supervisor, have that person ask me to hold me accountable, ask me how many visits I'm doing, have them show me how many visits I'm doing. So if it's the same thing with the form and the unannounced visits, all helping people to build expectations and to keep them on their game, we can do the same thing as principals, have people help us to stay on our game as well.
Well, I think that is a spectacular place to wrap it up. Great questioning, Jen, and your devil's advocacy today was great. You wear it well. Craig Randall.
I have a good mentor.
Yeah, right. That's what it is. Well, Craig Randall, the book is Trust-Based Observations, Maximizing Teaching and Learning Growth. And, we'll link to it in the show notes. And Jen, if folks email you, you'll send them a copy of the summary when it comes out.
I will.
Craig, thank you so much. This time flew by. I can't even believe it. It's wild. So thank you. Thank you for putting this into the world, Craig. And I'll tell you, you made me want to get back in there.
You should, Mike. You'd be great at it.
Thank you, guys. It's been great. And I'm really, really thankful for the opportunity.
Thank you. Great book. Great contribution.
Thanks for listening to this episode of the School Leadership Show, a podcast for aspiring and practicing school leaders. Send your comments, questions, and show ideas to me, Mike, at schoolleadershipshow.com. And please consider rating the podcast in iTunes and leaving a comment. And definitely pass the show along to your colleagues.